She came quietly, with questions too delicate for the world to hear, and left in silence, her body folded beneath the cathedral flowers. No one knew her story, until Miss Marple realized that the greatest danger isn't in what is spoken, but in the truths buried in silence. The morning sun fell gently over Miss Marple's modest garden, where the clematis had begun to show its delicate pink faces after a week of cool rain. She stood quietly with secretars in hand, examining a stubborn branch that had wandered away from the trellis, and reflected without bitterness how even plants had a mind of their own. It was at that moment Mrs. Bantry came bustling through the gate with a kind of rehearsed cheer. Her hat, ever slightly askew, bobbed with excitement. "My dear Jane," she said, her voice bright with purpose, "I simply won't let you weasel out of it this time. The garden club is going to Canterbury next Thursday. Cathedral gardens, embroidery exhibits, and a luncheon. Very proper, very civilized. We've already a seat saved for you." Miss Marple turned from the clematis with a slow smile. "Cathedral gardens do have a certain charm," she said, "though they are often better known for symmetry than surprise." Mrs. Bantry gave a small laugh. "Well, this one might astonish us both. Miss Clee has been giddy about it for weeks. She says the delphiniums are beyond belief." Miss Marple laid down her secrets. "Very well, Dolly, but only if there's no talk of the bishop's wife's compost again." The coach departed promptly from the village hall, filled with the agreeable murmur of middle-aged ladies in floral scarves and the scent of lemon soap. Miss Marple sat midway down the aisle, knitting in her lap and eyes softly alert. Miss Clee, seated just behind her, was positively bubbling. "I've read they have a monk's garden preserved, just as it was in the 15th century. Can you imagine?" At the rear sat Frau Hartmann, a widow of steely posture and pale gloves, who gazed out the window with something between detachment and quiet vigilance. Miss Marple watched her reflection in the glass. It was not suspicion that stirred in her. It was simply that years of watching village dramas unfold had taught her that stillness could speak volumes. They arrived in time for the 11 o'clock tour, and the cathedral's outer cloisters looked like something out of a watercolor. Neatly hedged paths, stone walls laced with ivy, and the unmistakable hush of sacred ground. The guide, a cheerful man with a tweed waistcoat and a fondness for his own jokes, led them through the herbaceous border with practiced rhythm. Miss Marple lingered near the rear, noting the gardener at work near the wall. A boy no older than 25, wiry, tanned, and methodical in the way he clipped the rosemary. He looked up only once briefly when the guide mentioned the delphinium beds. It was not the glance itself, but its absence of curiosity that caught Miss Marple's attention. He did not smile. He did not frown. He simply resumed his work. She had seen that kind of quietness before, and it was rarely without a story. They turned a corner of the cloister path, just as the guide began describing a stone bench supposedly favored by Thomas Becket. Miss Clee gave a startled cry, sharp enough to silence the group. Half hidden among the vivid blue delphiniums was the still figure of a woman, her dress blending with the soft earth beneath. Her head was tilted, her face obscured by a wide straw hat that had tumbled down across her cheek. The guide went pale. Mrs. Bantry clutched at her pearls. Someone whispered a prayer. Her rosary, its crucifix broken at the hinge, lay wrapped in the girl's right hand. Her dress was summer-weight cotton, plain but freshly pressed, and her hair was neatly tied with a cream ribbon. Miss Marple did not cry out, nor did she step forward. She stood perfectly still and listened, not only to the murmurs of distress, but to what was not being said. There was a quality to the silence that unnerved her more than the sight itself. It was, she thought, the silence of something long concealed now, forcing itself into the light. As the cathedral staff gently ushered the group away and summoned the authorities, Miss Marple moved discreetly to the edge of the garden bed and allowed her eyes to linger on the smallest details. There, along the hem of the girl's skirt, just above the instep of her shoe, was a dark smear of soil, not ordinary earth, but damp greenhouse mud, the kind rich with peat and ash. She had walked somewhere she ought not to have, and recently. And then, as the light breeze stirred the blooms and carried the scent of rosemary and early roses, Miss Marple's nostrils caught something else. Pipe smoke, not the light, airy kind, but deep and bulking, a dark blend with a signature bite. It clung to the edge of the garden, like a forgotten whisper. No one else seemed to notice. Miss Marple tucked the memory away, like a pressed flower, between the pages of a diary. She had long since learned that the smallest scents often pointed to the greatest secrets, and the quiet man with the pruning shears had not once looked up during the commotion. Not once. The party of visitors was led with gentle insistence away from the garden and down into the vaulted hush of the cathedral's crypt cafe. There, beneath ancient stone arches and the faint smell of limestone and tea cakes, the members of the St. Mary Garden Club sat in uneasy silence. Miss Clee busied herself with removing her gloves, finger by finger. Mrs. Bantry dabbed at her forehead with a lace-edged handkerchief, whispering to no one in particular that the world had simply gone wrong. The staff, to their credit, moved quietly. The tea service was brought out regardless, though no one touched the scone. A young deacon passed through with murmured apologies, and a pale-faced curate fetched a constable. Miss Marple remained composed, seated near the fireplace, her cup untouched, her eyes gently taken in the room. It was not panic that interested her. Panic was noisy and rarely true. It was restraint she watched for, the effort to remain undisturbed, the too careful holding of one's hands. Those were the signs that often whispered more loudly than any scream. And already she had noticed a curious silence in two faces that should not have been so calm. A young inspector entered and conferred with the cathedral's administrative secretary, who wore her mourning like a habit, though the death had not been hers to grieve. It was Iris Moliu, the inspector announced gently. She worked in the diocesan archives, temporary appointment, lived in lodgings on Sycamore Street. There was a rustle of mild surprise. The name was unfamiliar to most. Miss Clee whispered, "The girl with the long plaits, always reading at lunch." And Mrs. Bantry replied, "Never spoken, less spoken to." She was very quiet. Someone added, "The word carried an unease it didn't intend." Miss Marple glanced at the young vicar seated opposite her, who nodded gravely. She kept mostly to herself, did her work well, often stayed late, cataloging donation records and the war relief correspondence. The inspector's tone remained polite, but it was clear he sought connections. Anyone remember if she'd spoken of family or difficulties? No one answered at once. It wasn't that they didn't know. It was, Miss Marple observed, that they didn't quite care to have known her. That was sometimes worse. As tea was poured out, though barely touched, the conversation, like steam from the teapot, began to rise in small, unbidden wisps. Mrs. Bantry leaned toward Miss Marple, her voice lowered, but her eyes alight with energy. "I don't mean to be unkind, Jane, but a young girl working alone in a place like that, and living in lodgings, what sort of background do you suppose she came from?" Miss Marple gave no immediate reply. She was watching Miss Clee, who had been unusually quiet. "Iris asked me something odd once," Miss Clee said suddenly, "when we were helping the Veers sort out books in the old sacristy, those battered donation ledgers and unlabeled Bibles. She held up a brass medallion with a cross and an olive branch, said it had been slipped between the pages of a war register, asked if I thought it meant anything. I said it was probably decorative. A relic, perhaps," offered Mrs. Bantry. She looked disappointed. Miss Clee murmured. She put it in her pocket and never mentioned it again. Miss Marple stirred her tea without drinking. "Odd," she said softly. "That sort of thing tends to mean something to someone." What she didn't say aloud was this: a girl who lives quietly and asks questions in dusty corners is usually not lost. She is searching. For Hartman, who had until now said nothing, adjusted her gloves and cleared her throat. She had the poise of one accustomed to listening more than speaking. "I saw her crying," she said softly. "3 days ago. It was near the chapter house. She was standing behind the stone bench, facing the cloisters, very still but crying. There was a pause. The others turned to look at her. I did not speak," the widow continued. "It was not my place, but she looked not sorrowful, frightened perhaps, or confused, as if she had learned something she did not know how to carry." Mrs. Bantry shifted uncomfortably. "You're certain it was Iris?" "I am certain," for Hartman replied. "One remembers a girl who is too thin, too polite, and always alone. Miss Marple inclined her head, with a look of gentle encouragement. The widow had said little, but she had said the important part. Some emotions lingered in posture, and tears, Miss Marple knew well, were often the second thing to arrive. The first was usually the truth. While the others murmured, Miss Marple allowed herself a moment to observe two figures more carefully. Harold, but the young gardener, stood by the cathedral side door, half turned from the room, his head down. His fingers were still stained with damp earth, though his shirt sleeves were neatly rolled. He had not sat, nor had he met anyone's eyes. She watched as the inspector approached him with a quiet question. Harold's reply was short, his tone flat, and his gaze did not lift. Miss Marple remembered how he had continued pruning when the others cried out at the discovery. She had not forgotten. The cathedral librarian, by contrast, sat with chin high and fingers templed. He did not look sorrowful. He looked. Miss Marple searched for the word put upon. "The entire place will be in disarray," he muttered once, not quite under his breath. "You can't possibly expect the reading room to remain open now." Miss Marple blinked once. His concern was not that a girl had died, but that the schedule might be interrupted. "Odd thing," she said to Mrs. Bantry almost casually. "You'd think someone who worked among Scripture would have a more reflective sense of occasion." Some men, Mrs. Bantry replied, would complain about being late to their own funeral. The conversation drifted now toward the usual things, moral failings, vague warnings, and the peculiarities of young women without supervision. "She kept to herself," someone said again, as though it were a confession. "I always thought she was too clever for her station," another added, tapping her spoon. Miss Marple sipped her tea. She had heard such remarks before, cloaked in concern, but brimming with dismissal. Respectability, she thought, was a peculiar garment. It clothed even the cruelest judgments in good taste. But the village mind, even when transported to a cathedral garden, never quite let go of its rhythms. A girl alone, curious, perhaps too observant, was often seen as trouble waiting to happen. Miss Marple sat very still. The pieces were not yet connected, but the tone had been struck. And somewhere beneath it all, between tears seen, questions asked, and sullen glances refused, there was a pattern, and like embroidery, it would reveal itself not in the stitches, but in the silences between them. The following morning brought soft rain to St. Mary, which Miss Marple rather welcomed. It gave the impression of stillness, yet allowed thought to move uninterrupted. Over toast and a pale-boiled egg, she reread the small paragraph in the paper. The young woman found dead at Canterbury Cathedral had been identified as Miss Iris Molyneux, age 23, occupation, clerical assistant. No mention of next of kin, no mention of where she had come from. Later that day she walked to the vicarage ostensibly to return a borrowed hymnal, and found the vicar's wife at the parlor window. Iris, the woman mused, setting down her embroidery. Fostered, I believe. One of those wartime children who never quite had a proper home again. Stayed on in Kent with an older couple, but I dare say they passed on. She was very quiet, exceptionally polite though. Miss Marple nodded gently. Children who grew up with polite silence often did so in place of comfort. They learned to behave impeccably, knowing they had no birthright to fall back on. She told me once, the vicar's wife continued, that she'd saved up to take a course in shorthand, but the fees had risen and she couldn't bear to ask anyone. So she took the cathedral job instead. Said it felt close to something real. It was not bitterness in the telling. It was something quieter, recognition perhaps, of a girl who asked for very little and received even less. Miss Marple made her way discreetly to Sycamore Street, where Iris had lodged in a modest brick house, with ivy crawling toward the windows. The landlady, Mrs. Nettle, was a brisk woman in her late 50s, with a fondness for flour-dusted aprons and rhetorical questions. She wasn't any bother, I'll say that, Mrs. Nettle reported over the clatter of her teacups. Paid her rent on time, went out walking most evenings toward the river path, read a lot, always writing little notes. I think she kept a sort of journal. Did she receive many visitors? Hardly any. Only one I remember clearly. A tall fellow. Had pulled down too far. Said he was her cousin. Came just at dusk one Thursday. Made her pale as anything. She didn't invite him in. They stood in the hallway and talked very low. I couldn't hear what was said, but when he left, she locked her door and I heard her crying. Miss Marple sipped her tea. The word cousin was a useful one. Vague, harmless, easily applied, but it was rarely the whole truth when used unannounced. Mrs. Nettle allowed Miss Marple, with mild reluctance, to see Iris's room. It was a narrow space with slanted light, and a pale floral counterpane smoothed so many times the pattern had faded. There was little there. A small Bible with her name written neatly in the front. A second-hand coat hanging on the back of the door. A plain jewelry box containing 2 silver hairpins, and a broken brooch and a postcard. It lay on the bedside table, its edges curled. The image was of Whitstable Beach in spring. Pebbles, seaweed, gulls suspended in a pale sky. The top corner was creased from repeated turning, as though it had been handled often, perhaps in thought rather than intention. Miss Marple turned it over. No message, just the name, Aunt Ruth, scrolled faintly in pencil, then rubbed away. Only the impression remained. People rarely rubbed out names entirely. They preferred to let them fade. She held the card for a moment longer before replacing it. Postcards were never simply souvenirs. They were fragments of belonging, something to claim a memory when no one else would remember for you. By the window sill stood a small wooden frame, lacquer chipped at one corner. Inside a black and white photograph, Iris standing just off-center in a modest frock and sensible shoes, smiling without effort. Beside her stood another girl in a nun's habit. The second figure's face had been scratched out with what must have been a hairpin. Deliberate, not impulsive, not a torn photograph flung away in haste, but an act of quiet severance kept in place. Miss Marple looked closer. The 2 young women stood before a brick archway, ivy-covered and modest in structure, the kind found behind convent buildings or old-school houses. The ground was wet with recent rain, and Iris's shoes bore the faint darkening at the hem. There was something affectionate in the posture, arms close, shoulders nearly touching. Scratched-out faces rarely indicated hatred. More often, they denoted sorrow too great to name, a loss of confidence or trust. Miss Marple tucked her hands neatly before her and studied the pale room. Iris had not lived here long, but she had brought her fragments with her, her beach, her name, her memory torn at the edge. Whatever she had not sought it blindly. Back at the vicarage, the fire was lit despite the gentle June air, and the vicar's wife served lavender biscuits with the restraint of one who did not wish to seem indulgent. She was interested in the cloister wall, the vicar's wife said, passing the sugar. Asked after the war memorial, particularly the newer names, the ones added after 1948. I told her they were names long debated. Some had been missed in earlier records. Clerks, volunteers, even a groundsman. Miss Marple nodded. One forgets how long shadows may take to appear, especially when light was once refused. She had questions about a larch, or so I recall, not a common name. Said she believed he had served and never been properly honored. But I think what she really wanted was to know if he had been remembered at all. Large, Miss Marple sipped her tea. It's a sturdy tree. Grows in difficult soil, but it sheds easily. She was never intrusive. The vicar's wife added, just persistent. I sometimes think she was looking for more than remembrance. Perhaps she was seeking forgiveness in someone else's name. Miss Marple didn't answer. Forgiveness, after all, could rarely be given without the truth. The story that unfolded in Miss Marple's mind was not yet complete, but its outlines had begun to form. A girl without a name of her own had traced threads through documents and tombstones, collecting not facts, but shadows. There had been someone, a woman in religious service, a severed relationship, a whispered memory, and a man who came at dusk, calling himself cousin, but bringing only fear. There was a medallion, a name scratched from history, and a tearful vigil by the chapter house wall. Iris had walked softly, asked gently, and remained unseen, not because she was invisible, but because those around her had chosen not to look closely. Miss Marple folded her gloves neatly in her lap. She had seen it before. Young people trying to build identity from silence, from the spaces left in the margins of other people's stories. And she suspected that someone had known exactly what Iris had found, and had feared what might happen if she shared it. She did not yet know who, but she felt with quiet certainty that it had not been hatred that killed the girl. It had been the desperate hope to stop a truth from taking root. 2 days after the Garden Club's ill-fated outing, Miss Marple returned to the cathedral. She did not announce herself to the constables, nor suggest any official interest. Instead, she expressed to the assistant sacristan her passing interest in the cathedral's medieval embroidery, particularly a set of ecclesiastical panels rumored to have survived the dissolution. The sacristan, a young man inclined to helpfulness, guided her through the side aisles, past a carved miserord, and into a quiet exhibition space rarely visited on weekday mornings. There, amid the gentle solemnity of gold thread and sacred history, Miss Marple asked her questions. Not directly, of course. That would have been impolite. She merely inquired whether many of the clergy now serving had come to their rolls after the war, whether ordination had increased in the post-war years, whether records had ever been lost or by necessity rewritten. The sacristan, caught between reverence and curiosity, offered a few thoughtful replies. A great many men had returned from service with spiritual scars, he said. Some found in the cloth a place of redemption. Others perhaps found concealment. Miss Marple nodded gently. In times of war, she murmured, people often acquire more than medals. Sometimes they acquire burdens. Later that morning, Miss Marple lingered near the vestry steps, where the scent of beeswax and stone mingled with the quiet rhythm of daily duties. She struck up conversation with the canon's housekeeper, a woman of precise diction and modest humor, under the gentle pretext of admiring the Polish on the oak floors. You must have known Miss Molière. The housekeeper pursed her lips, didn't speak much, kind though she was terribly interested in the ordination ledgers, asked me more than once about the additions made after the war, especially the emergency ordinations. Miss Marple nodded with appropriate modesty. Quite understandable. I imagine there was a certain urgency post-1945. The woman shrugged. Some didn't have proper records. But what choice was there? The needs of the church don't wait for the ink to dry. A little later, by the west cloister, she found the sexton's wife tending the flower beds. Miss Marple complimented the foxglove and remarked on how quiet the garden had become since the incident. She was curious about names, the woman said almost unprompted. The girl, she asked about clergy who'd come from abroad, said she was trying to understand a connection. Miss Marple thanked her gently and tucked the phrasing away. Understand a connection. A curious way to describe something most would simply call research. That afternoon, Miss Marple returned briefly to the small reference library beside the chapter house. It was not large, but it was tidy, and the librarian, Mr. Elephant Stone, was as dry as the paper he curated. She inquired, with all the softness of a casual visitor, whether the War Memorial Bibles had been moved. They're in the south alcove, he replied curtly, though they're not for public handling. She nodded agreeably. Quite right. I'd heard, you see, that one of the younger clerks, Miss Molyneux, had found something rather touching among the pages. A letter, was it? He blinked. I wouldn't know. Miss Marple tilted her head gently. No, only I was told it was a soldier's Bible. Tucked within the names was an unsigned letter, and Iris, Miss Molyneux, showed it to someone, but no one quite knows where it is now. He looked away. Anything of that sort should have been brought to me. If it had any ecclesiastical relevance, I'd have addressed it. There was a pause. Miss Marple smiled faintly. Of course, still, it's remarkable how many sacred things are forgotten in sacred places. The librarian did not reply. He merely returned to his indexing, just a little too briskly. At the parish tea 2 days later, held in the refectory as a quiet gesture of return to routine, Miss Marple found herself in polite conversation with Mrs. Canfield, a widow who had once volunteered in the diocese archives. The talk turned, as such things often do, to memory and lost paperwork. Mrs. Canfield spoke of a peculiar brass medallion Iris had once shown her. Olive branch Latin motto. I said it looked Masonic, but she shook her head. Said it belonged to a group called the Silent Clergy. Miss Marple kept her expression neutral. I've never heard of it. Neither had I. She said it was something unofficial. Clergy who did work during the occupation, smuggling refugees, children mostly through parishes across borders. There was a priest who died in Belgium. I think Iris believed someone connected to him ended up here in Canterbury. Miss Marple nodded slowly. Such work was rarely documented. Precisely what she said. She thought the medallion proved a connection. Miss Marple glanced toward the cloisters, their shadows long against the wall. If Iris had uncovered ties between a respected clergyman and a forgotten war network, then she might have stepped on ground others would rather left undisturbed, especially if that man had risen high or remained hidden. The past, when dug up carelessly, has a way of bringing up roots too tangled to replant. The gardener, Harold, but had spoken to police early on. He had been in the greenhouse at the time of the girl's death. He said no one had seen him, but he had a routine: watering trays, sorting seed packets, and repairing a cracked planter. Miss Marple, in conversation with a young curate who helped tend the cathedral's herb garden, asked whether the greenhouse had been particularly active that week. The curate frowned. Funny thing, I was in there Thursday morning. No tools laid out, no pots disturbed. The cracked urn he claimed to be working on was still standing, untouched. She made no outward remark, but she later passed Harold herself, near the cloister walk. His shirt was stained with earth. She observed the smear of peat beneath one fingernail and the nervous way he handled his shears. Terrible business, she said quietly. He nodded. She shouldn't have been snooping. Miss Marple blinked. I beg your pardon. He looked away. I only meant she asked questions. People don't like that, do they? No, Miss Marple replied gently. But truth has a way of blooming regardless. He did not answer. But his boot, she noted, left a dark mark in the path's gravel, cathedral soil, damp and distinct, and not from the greenhouse. Miss Marple stood later that evening by the cloister garden, hands folded as though in thought, eyes wandering the flower beds. The delphiniums had been cut back now, trimmed and reordered, as though death had not briefly lain there. Spring had returned with quiet insistence. The bulbs had pushed through again, as they always did, roots unbothered by the human world. She thought of Iris, moving through these paths with questions too delicate for the hearing of others, seeking a father's name, perhaps a link to goodness in the wreckage of history. And she thought, too, of those who bore guilt not for what they did, but for what they could not allow to be seen. Some secrets are buried in silence, some in honor, but the ones that rot deepest are the ones meant to protect reputation over truth. She bent down, touched a bit of thyme, and inhaled gently. The scent was sharp, medicinal, like memory. When she straightened, her eyes fell once more on the west walk, the path where Iris had last been seen walking, where she had stopped, looked up, and met the eyes of someone she thought she could trust. And then Miss Marple turned back toward the refectory. The past had spoken enough. It was time to listen to what remained in the present. The soft toll of the evening bell had barely faded when the sacristan noticed the broken lock. The vestry door, rarely used save for ceremonial processions, hung open by a breath, as if left ajar by hesitation. The lanterns along the wall flickered uneasily, disturbed not by wind, but by presence. Inside, silence had weight. A stone urn, once displayed in quiet reverence near the vestry's rear alcove, now lay shattered across the flagstone floor. Pale ash and twisted parchment spilled from its remains, as though the object had held something more than memory. The police were summoned at once, but the intruder, if there had been one, had taken nothing of value. The chalices were untouched, vestments folded in order, the books undisturbed. Yet something unmistakable had been disturbed. Miss Marple, who happened to be taking supper with the vicar's wife when the news came through, listened to the account with interest. "It's very odd," the vicar said, frowning. "Why break a sacred urn and steal nothing?" "Not odd at all," murmured Miss Marple, her fingers resting lightly on the teacup rim. "Some things, you see, are broken only to reveal what lies inside." The question, of course, was not who had entered, but what they feared would be found before them. The fragments swept from the vestry floor revealed something the urn had long hidden. Thin envelopes browned at the edges, some scorched. Among them were wartime letters written in formal script and dated between 1946 and 1948. Their contents, though partially faded, spoke clearly enough. Correspondence between senior clergy regarding a girl, unnamed, brought into the country without proper documentation. She'll be given a new name. One letter read. Arrangements made through the Southern office. Any records should be sealed until it is deemed safe to disclose her parentage. The bishop's secretary handed them to the authorities, but not before the contents circled the cathedral walls in whispers. A girl concealed in the wake of war. A girl given a life built on a lie. Miss Marple, reading the report quietly by the fireside, pressed her lips together in thought. It was not uncommon in those years for children to be taken in without the formality of law. There had been many lost, many left behind. But the question now loomed larger than the identity of a child. It was whether Iris Molyneux had discovered she was that child, and who might have stood to lose if she had spoken aloud what she had begun to uncover. The letters triggered further examination, and with it a name, Canon Reeves. It was soon recalled that Reeves had served overseas in 1947, stationed at a displaced persons camp outside Stoutgate. He had returned to England shortly after, his record apparently unblemished, but several clergy remembered vaguely that he had accompanied a group of orphans during his return. One of them, it was speculated, could have been the girl in question. Iris's name, when placed beside the correspondence, stirred uneasy glances. She had asked about war records. She had asked about Reeves. The cathedral chapter grew tense. Reeves was respected. He had served quietly and without ambition, but memory, like old plaster, cracks under pressure. Miss Marple, seated during evensong gong, observed Reeves from the rear pew. His hands trembled during the reading, and his voice faltered on a psalm. But it was not guilt she read on his face. It was weariness, the weight not of sin, but of having borne silence too long. She wondered, not for the first time, whether he had protected the girl in 1947, and whether now, decades later, he would be made to pay for what others had chosen to forget. The matter escalated when a former charity clerk came forward with a quiet claim. Canon Reeves, she said, had received an envelope of funds from an organization known as Next Day, a now-defunct group that once facilitated refugee movement through ecclesiastical channels. I delivered it myself, the woman insisted, 3 days before the girl was found. The whisper grew into a rumor, and the rumor reached the bishop's office. Within hours, Reeves was placed under administrative suspension, and the authorities questioned him in full. The money, Reeves explained, had been an old stipend, delayed funds from a clergy relief trust long since shuttered. It was meant, he said, for the upkeep of a parish widow he had quietly supported for years. But in the court of cathedral gossip, truth rarely stood clean for long. Miss Marple sat with Mrs. Bantry at the vicarage hearth as the news was relayed. A scandal, Mrs. Bantry murmured. I never would have thought him capable. Miss Marple was silent a long moment, then softly. It is one thing to accept funds, quite another to kill a girl to keep a secret. We must be careful not to mistake proximity for motive. And in her mind she still saw a gloved hand brushing soil from a path where no widow had ever walked. Later that afternoon, Miss Marple returned to the vestry with a polite excuse. She wished to deliver a set of knitted bookmarks to the Vere's wife for the charity sale. No one questioned her presence. She lingered near the broken urn, its base now set upon a linen cloth beside the sacred table. The fingerprints had been taken and the urn's interior scrubbed, but on its underside remained a faint smudge, darker than ash, granular. She touched it with the corner of her handkerchief, then folded the cloth, and left quietly. That evening she visited the greenhouse with a modest question about foxglove propagation. Harold, but surprised but polite, showed her the pots. As he gestured to a nearby tray, she noticed his thumb, cracked and ridged, still dark beneath the nail despite the week's time. On the workbench lay a cloth for wiping blades, patterned faintly with pollen and soil. Next to it, a pair of garden shears, sharp and recently oiled. Miss Marple smiled and asked about pruning cycles. He spoke hesitantly, his answers clipped, then hurried to excuse himself. She stepped outside, the evening light brushing her face. She knew now that the fingerprint on the urn had not belonged to a canon's hand, but to one that worked the earth, and to one who had something else to bury. By the week's end, the cathedral was no longer a place of sanctuary, but of whispers. Canon Reeves, though uncharged, had withdrawn from public duties. The bishop's expression had grown carved. Mrs. Canfield wept quietly in the library, and Harold but was seen less often, tending the cloister beds only before dawn. People spoke now in hushed fragments about letters, about the girl, about war. No one said the word murder, but it hung in the stone arches like dust. Miss Marple sipped tea at the vicarage and listened. The choir no longer rehearsed in full voice. The archive clerks carried papers as if they were burdens. "It's the uncertainty," the vicar's wife said quietly. "Everyone's afraid they'll be next to be asked, or next to be blamed," Miss Marple replied. She watched the way truth eroded the walls, not by force, but by presence. It had walked once in Iris's shoes, down the cloisters, toward a name carved too late into stone, and it would walk again. What remained now was to let it speak, and Miss Marple, as ever, would be the one to listen. The parlor of the vicarage was filled with the comforting scent of camphor polish and early spring hyarin. Miss Marple took her tea in silence, allowing the vicar's wife to recount the details of the most recent church fete, which had ended in a modest surplus and one collapsed card table. The vicar, seated in his accustomed chair, stirred his tea slowly. "It's the oddest thing," Miss Marple said quite gently. "When we found that poor girl, I could have sworn there was a trace of Balkan tobacco in the air. A very particular sort, quite strong and earthy." The vicar blinked. "Not many people smoke a Balkan blend these days. It's rather hard to come by." "Indeed," Miss Marple replied, "though I'm told young Harold but does, the gardener. His father used to keep tins of it in a biscuit tin. A habit passed down, perhaps." The vicar's wife looked up. "Harold, I believe he still orders it from a tobacconist in Dover. Odd lad, keeps to himself. Very respectful." Miss Marple nodded and smiled. "Yes, very respectful. And yet I do wonder why that particular scent lingered near the delphiniums. Perhaps not everyone noticed, but I always find that scent remembers where it's been, even when people prefer not to." The following morning, Miss Marple walked to the post office under the pretext of sending a note to her niece in Plymouth. The postmistress, Mrs. Pierce, a trim woman with an eye for order and a fondness for layered sponge, was sorting the outgoing mail when Miss Marple inquired quite delicately about unposted letters found among Iris Molyneux's things. "I believe there was one," Mrs. Pierce said, lowering her voice. "Didn't get far. Inspector took it into custody, but let me have a glance before. Addressed simply to Aunt R., no surname. The handwriting was very careful, almost childlike in its neatness. May I ask the contents?" Mrs. Pierce hesitated, then continued. "It wasn't long. She wrote that she had found the truth at last, that she understood now, and no longer blamed her. She said she was going to speak with him, and that if anything should happen, it wasn't to be her aunt's fault. And the signature, Iris, no surname, just Iris." Miss Marple walked slowly back to the vicarage. A letter never posted is often the most truthful kind. It is written not for delivery, but to satisfy the soul, and this one had been written with forgiveness in mind. That made it all the more dangerous. Miss Marple returned that afternoon to the cathedral library, where the archivist, Mr. Elphinstone, sat surrounded by accession records and wartime correspondence arranged as meticulously as a sermon. She paused by the shelf of diocesan registers, brushing her gloved fingers lightly along the spines. "Mr. Elphinstone," she said with unassuming clarity. "Do you recall the name Robert Larch?" His shoulders stiffened. "A minor staff officer briefly attached to a relief unit in 1947. Never held a post here. I believe Miss Molyneux came across his name, possibly in connection with the silent clergy and post-war movement of orphans." He gave a small guarded nod. There was some confusion. He was involved in unofficial arrangements, accused of mismanaging donations, discharged from relief work, disappeared for a time. There was no formal record, and yet his name appears in some of the marginalia, Miss Marple remarked softly. "Not in the official ledgers, but penciled in on the back of a mass leaflet. Large C in voice for Metz. It suggests he was still active in 1948. The librarian said nothing, but his eyes had narrowed slightly. Miss Molyneux was not the kind of girl who parried. Miss Marple continued. She was the kind who quietly connected the threads, and in doing so, she found her father. The archivist blinked once slowly, The silence between them thickened, not with denial, but with confirmation not spoken aloud. It was not hard now to see the shape of things. Iris had grown up as a foster child, passed between quiet homes and modest caretakers. Her history, what little she had been told, was likely shaded with half-truths. Her mother who had gone early, her father unknown, the war blamed for the rest. But in the corners of records and whispered connections, she had found his name. Robert Larch, a man once entrusted with children, later discredited and never spoken of again. MissMarple sat by the window and considered it. A girl of her age working in a cathedral archive would find patterns the way others find poems and hymns. Slowly, patiently, she had traced his shadow, and perhaps she had found more. Perhaps she had approached him, that man who had called himself cousin, seen by the landlady one evening near dusk. It was not hatred that had followed her discovery. It was fear. The fear of a truth returning at the wrong time. The fear of someone asking to be acknowledged when their existence had always been inconvenient. MissMarple sipped her tea. There was no more dangerous request in this world than to be recognized. Iris had not been a blackmailer, nor a spiteful girl. Everything suggested a mind turned not to vengeance, but to completion. She wanted the story to make sense. She wanted her name to mean something. Her questions had not been accusatory. They had been quietly sincere, asking who had made decisions, asking why a child should have to grow without knowing her parent, asking perhaps why a church built upon compassion had allowed silence to stand in place of kindness. MissMarple thought of the scratched photograph, the young nun, whose face had been erased, not with violence, but with grief. Iris had already been denied a mother. In discovering her father, she had hoped to reclaim a part of herself. What frightened others, MissMarple realized, was not what she knew, but what she might say. In the cathedral, surrounded by names carved in stone, a living girl's identity had threatened the balance. She had not wanted to ruin reputations. She had simply wanted to be known. And for some that had been too much. The final piece fell into place, not through a statement, but through memory. MissMarple sat in the cloister garden, watching Harold but trimmed the edges of the lawn with almost ceremonial neatness. His movements were careful, too careful. She remembered the smear on Iris's hem. It was not field dirt or road dust. It was damp, cultivated soil, the kind used in cathedral beds mixed with peat and sand. It clung to fabric in a distinctive way. Harold, who claimed to have been in the greenhouse, had no reason to be near the delphiniums at that hour, and yet his boots had shown the same stain. His fingers bore the same dark crescent of damp mulch. And there was something else. The pipe smoke. A scent no one else had remarked upon, because no one else recognized it. Only MissMarple, who had once lived next to a gentleman who smoked nothing but Bullen blend, knew it for what it was, and Harold but was the only one who still ordered it. She looked at him as he straightened from his work. He met her gaze, held it too long, then looked away. Some truths, she thought, do not shout. They simply settle like soil on cloth, and if one is wise, one watches where the footprints lead. Harold's had led straight through the delphiniums, and he, unlike Iris, had something to hide. The invitation arrived modestly, penned in MissMarple's graceful hand, and made no allusion to solemnity. Tea in the refectory room at 4 o'clock. It read, a simple gathering in remembrance. There were no bold underlinings, no dramatic hints, just a line or two of respect, enough to draw in the right people without arousing suspicion. By the hour appointed, a handful had arrived. The cathedral librarian, Mr. Elphinstone, stiffer than ever. For Hartman, her expression as still as winterglass. Mrs. Bantry, bustling but watchful. The canon's housekeeper, the vicar's wife, and Harold but shoulders tense beneath his gardening jacket. MissMarple presided without presumption, pouring tea into fine porcelain as if it were nothing more than a quiet Sunday. The only sign of difference was the faint tremor in the air, not of weather, but of waiting. My dear friends, she began with gentle composure, we've all felt the weight of recent days. But sometimes, even beneath the stone of a cathedral garden, roots grow deeper than we imagine. And sometimes the truth arrives not with thunder, but with memory. They leaned in, uncertain, yet knowing, as people always do, that they had come to witness a reckoning dressed in civility. She was not a girl with grand ambition. Miss Marple began, her tone composed yet purposeful. Emmeline asked very little from a world, only enough truth to understand where she belonged. She was raised with kindness, I believe, but not the kind that answers questions. Her childhood was built on the silence of others, and silence, as I have often said, can be the cruelest inheritance. She came to Canterbury not to accuse, but to comprehend. Her work in the archive placed her among the records others had long stopped reading. Yet she read them, not for history, but for herself. Ah, she pieced together a picture no one wanted her to see. Miss Marple paused to pour another cup. No one stirred. She learned that her father was not some faceless soldier lost in France, but a man still living, still known to many of you. She hoped not to shame him, but to be seen, to be acknowledged, and for that she paid dearly. Mrs. Bantry's fingers clutched the edge of her napkin. The librarian cleared his throat, though he said nothing, and Harold in his corner grew very still. Robert Larch, Miss Marple said simply. A name few recall openly, though it appears in curious places, in letters behind vestry doors, in marginal notes, in orphanage transfers that were meant to be forgotten. He was involved in post-war clergy relief, though not through official channels. Black market dealings tainted his record, and he vanished for a time. But he did not disappear entirely. He returned under a different name, held quiet positions, was protected by those who felt his earlier efforts had been, shall we say, well-intended. Mr. Elphinstone shifted, and for the first time did not speak in protest. Iris discovered his name while examining memorial inconsistencies. Names added years after the fact, some quietly scrubbed from view. She traced him not through gossip, but through diligence. Her discovery was not an attack, but an appeal. She met him here. He denied her, of course, as did the system that had failed to protect her identity or recognize it. But it was not he who silenced her. The room tightened like thread drawn through cloth. Miss Marple waited. There is a kind of justice in pausing before a name is revealed. It was someone else. Miss Marple continued. Someone who overheard, someone who knew Iris had found her truth and feared the consequence of it. Not for themselves, but for what might unravel. Harold, but she said gently, turning to him, you had affection for her. It was not unkind. I believe it was genuine in its way. But when you overheard her speak of exposing the truth, you misunderstood. You thought she would destroy the sanctuary that had protected so many. You imagined her reckless, ungrateful, and perhaps in that moment you feared you would lose her altogether. Harold said nothing. His hands lay motionless in his lap. You confronted her in the garden. Perhaps you asked her not to speak. Perhaps she said she must. Perhaps she turned away. I do not believe you intended to kill her. But anger is a sudden thing, and fear, especially the fear of losing something never truly yours, can turn a moment into tragedy. Mrs. Bantry whispered. He was always quiet but kind. Quiet, yes, Miss Marple replied, but not untroubled. He believed he was protecting something sacred. The irony, of course, is that Iris wanted nothing more than to protect herself. Harold raised his eyes slow and unblinking. There was no denial in them, only the brittle aftermath of sorrow. Miss Marple rose and walked to a small side table where a box sat beneath a folded linen napkin. She opened it, revealing a single garden glove, weathered, left-handed, and faintly stained. This, she said quietly, was found behind the lower wall, buried shallow, but not deeply enough to outlast the week's rain. It is yours, I believe, Harold. You said it went missing a fortnight ago. He looked down, saying nothing. The soil upon it matches the beds near the delphiniums. And these, she drew out a small envelope, are pollen grains from the same flower heads found embedded in the fabric. She paused, letting the room listen to the silence. Iris was found with a broken rosary. She often walked alone, but the hem of her dress bore a smear of moist soil, fresh, not dry, and the impression on the garden path indicated another had been there. Larger shoes, heavy-soled. You wore them that morning. Harold's voice came at last, low and cracked. I didn't mean to. I only wanted her to stop. She wouldn't listen. Miss Marple's face remained calm, her tone steady. And so you silenced her with hands that had hoped to plant beauty. The glove lay between them like an unspoken confession. No one rose. No one shouted. The air did not burst into alarm. It simply folded inwards like the final page of a well-read book. Harold sat very still. He did not protest. His expression held no defiance, only the solemn fatigue of a man who had carried the weight of a moment too long. The cathedral librarian removed his spectacles and polished them in silence. Mrs. Bantry wept quietly behind her handkerchief. Miss Marple looked not at Harold, but at the room itself. "It is easy," she said softly, "to condemn the act and forget the heart behind it. But the law will do as it must, and we perhaps must remember that not all harm is born of hatred. Sometimes it is born of fear, cloaked in reverence." The clock chimed the half-hour. Miss Marple rose and folded her gloves. "There's no joy in truth, only justice," she added. "And justice in its truest form is the remembering of what was denied." And with that the tea concluded, not with applause or pronouncement, but with the steady hush of understanding. Outside the cloisters held their shadows as they always had, but within something unspoken had found its voice. The sun, modest and low, dappled the borders of Miss Marple's garden with a softened clarity. The clematis, neglected during her days away, had wound itself into curious shapes, some elegant, others unruly, several tugging against the very trellis meant to hold them in place. Miss Marple stood before them in her wide-brimmed hat, secrets in hand, her gaze not fixed on any bloom in particular, but rather on the nature of growth itself. It was a habit of plants, she reflected, to seek direction only when offered guidance. Left to their own devices, they tangled, sometimes beautifully, sometimes to their own detriment. She clipped a woolward strand and watched it fall to the soil. There had been no malice in the vine, only its need to stretch and be seen. So, too, she thought, had it been with Iris, a young woman who had grown where no one had planned for her to grow, who had asked questions no one had intended to answer. In the end, the danger had not been in her discovery, but in how others feared what it might mean for their carefully tended world. Miss Marple laid her gloves beside the potting bench and turned to the garden gate. The world, like a border of clematis, required tending, not to control its beauty, but to understand its shape. The vicarage drawing-room held a quiet warmth, the kind that grew up not from fire, but from long familiarity. Miss Marple stirred her tea gently, while the vicar's wife settled in her needle-point chair, poured a second cup. "It was all rather sad in the end," she murmured. "Not tragic in the usual sense. No great villain, no scandal in the papers, but a kind of quiet sorrow that stays with you." Miss Marple nodded. "Yes, it is the sort of sadness that arises not from what was done, but what was never spoken of." She only wanted to know where she came from, the vicar's wife said, more to herself than her guest. So many spend years running from their past. Iris walked straight into hers. "Indeed," said Miss Marple. "She didn't ask for reparations, only recognition, a name, a history to belong to." The vicar's wife sighed. "And poor Harold, I can't quite bring myself to hate him." "No," Miss Marple agreed, "but he will carry the weight of misunderstanding. That is punishment enough." Outside, the hedges whispered in the breeze. In every parish, Miss Marple thought there were stories shaped not by what people said, but by what they dared not say. As she folded her gloves into her handbag and rose to leave, Miss Marple paused. "Some truths do not comfort," she said softly, "but they do give dignity, and that perhaps is all Iris ever sought. Sometimes the most tragic crimes are not committed out of malice, but fear. In the end, it wasn't hatred that took Iris's life, but a desperate attempt to silence a truth that had already grown roots in the past. And yet, as Miss Marple reminds us, truth has a quiet persistence. It waits in letters uninked gloves mislaid in the soil beneath cathedral walls. And when it finally emerges, it doesn't roar. It whispers. For Iris, the truth did not come in time to save her, but it did arrive at last to honor her. There's a certain dignity in being known, even if belatedly. Iris didn't seek revenge or exposure, only understanding. And it was precisely that quiet intention which frightened others more than any threat ever could. In a world too often governed by appearances, a girl asking, "Who am I?" truly became more dangerous than a thief with a motive.